The interstellar transport vessel Meridian's Edge had been humanity's first successful attempt at peaceful contact with the Zephyrian Empire, a civilization that spanned 3 star systems and commanded technology that made Earth's most advanced achievements look like primitive cave paintings. The diplomatic mission had taken 18 months to arrange, with countless transmissions, cultural exchanges, and delicate negotiations that had nearly collapsed twice due to misunderstandings about honor protocols and territorial boundaries. Commander Marcus Chin stood in the observation deck of the Earth Alliance vessel Aurora Dawn, watching as the Zephyrian diplomatic craft approached. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a seamless crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around itself, creating an almost hypnotic effect as it moved through space. The ship's movements were too fluid, too perfect, defying the mechanical limitations that govern human spacecraft. "Sir, they're requesting permission to dock," reported Lieutenant Sarah Vasquez from the communications station, her voice betraying a slight tremor of nervousness. This was the moment that would either cement humanity's place among the galactic community or condemn them to continued isolation in their small corner of the universe. Marcus had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. He had studied every available piece of intelligence about Zephyrian culture, their complex caste system, their reverence for mental discipline, and their particular sensitivity to what they called mind noise, the constant mental chatter that seemed to characterize most sentient species. The Zephyrians prized silence, contemplation, and what their texts described as inner fortress construction, a mental discipline that allowed them to maintain perfect emotional control even in the most challenging circumstances. "Grant them permission to dock at Bay 7, Marcus commanded, straightening his formal diplomatic uniform. "And remind all crew members about the protocols. No unnecessary conversation, no displays of emotion, and absolutely no direct eye contact with the princess unless she initiates it first." The Zephyrian delegation consisted of 12 individuals, but only one truly mattered for the success of this mission. Princess Aeliana Vexthera was the youngest daughter of the Zephyrian Emperor, but, more importantly, she was the architect of the Empire's new policy of selective engagement with developing civilizations. Her word could open doors to technological advancement, trade agreements, and protection that would transform human civilization, or it could close them forever with a single negative assessment. What made Princess Aeliana unique among her people was not just her political influence, but her reputation for absolute silence. According to the intelligence reports, she had not spoken a single word in any public setting for over 7 Earth years. Some claimed it was a religious vow, others suggested it was a form of protest against the Empire's more aggressive expansion policies, but most believed it was simply an extreme manifestation of the Zephyrian ideal of mental discipline. She communicated through a complex system of hand gestures, telepathic projection to trained interpreters, and what her people called presence communication, the ability to convey meaning through subtle changes in posture, energy, and what humans might call aura. The airlock hissed open, and the Zephyrian delegation stepped aboard the Aurora Dawn. The effect was immediately noticeable. The very air seemed to change, becoming somehow heavier and more charged with potential energy. The Zephyrians moved with a fluid grace that made human movement seem clumsy and inefficient by comparison. They were humanoid in basic structure, but taller and more elegant, with elongated limbs and features that seemed almost sculptural in their perfection. Their skin had a faint luminescent quality, shifting between pale blue and silver depending on the angle of the light, and their eyes were large and dark, containing depths that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. Princess Aeliana entered last, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat despite his diplomatic training. She was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, but she carried herself with an authority that filled the entire docking bay. Her hair was long and white with streaks of silver, flowing behind her like liquid mercury, and she wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, dark blue shot through with points of light that moved like distant stars. What struck Marcus most powerfully was her eyes. They were completely black, not just the iris but the entire visible portion, and they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When she looked at him, which she did for exactly 3 seconds before looking away, he felt as if she had somehow seen directly into his soul and catalogued every strength, weakness, fear, and aspiration he possessed. The formal reception proceeded according to the carefully rehearsed protocols. Marcus delivered his welcome speech, outlining humanity's hopes for cooperation and friendship with the Zephyrian Empire. The princess's interpreter, an elderly Zephyrian male with intricate tattoos covering his arms, translated her responses through a combination of spoken words and telepathic impressions that Marcus could somehow sense at the edge of his consciousness. Her Imperial Highness acknowledges the welcome of the human delegation, the interpreter said in accented but clear English. She notes the effort that has been made to observe proper protocols and finds this adequate. The word adequate hung in the air like a judgment. Marcus had hoped for something more positive, but he understood that among the Zephyrians, adequate was actually a fairly high form of praise. They did not engage in the social pleasantries and excessive politeness that characterized human diplomacy. Their communications were precise, economical, and brutally honest. Over the following days, the diplomatic talks proceeded with painstaking care. The princess attended every session, sitting in perfect stillness for hours at a time, her black eyes observing everything while revealing nothing. She never spoke, never made any sound at all, but Marcus began to sense that she was somehow participating in the discussions on a level that went beyond mere observation. There were moments when the negotiations seemed deadlocked, when the human and Zephyrian positions appeared irreconcilable, and then something would shift, some subtle change in the energy of the room, and suddenly new possibilities would emerge. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the mission's xenopsychologist, became fascinated by the princess's behavior patterns. She's not just silent, Elena explained to Marcus during one of their evening briefings. She's actively using her silence as a form of communication. Watch her during the trade negotiations tomorrow. Every time Ambassador Reynolds makes a point she agrees with, she'll adjust her posture slightly, maybe shift her weight from one foot to the other. When she disagrees, she becomes completely still, like a statue. It's incredibly subtle, but once you learn to read it, it's as clear as spoken language. Marcus had noticed this phenomenon himself, but he was beginning to suspect there was something more complex happening. The princess wasn't just communicating through body language, she seemed to be influencing the emotional atmosphere of the room itself. During particularly tense moments, when voices were raised and tempers flared, her presence had a calming effect that went beyond normal diplomatic intervention. People would find themselves speaking more quietly, choosing their words more carefully, approaching problems with greater patience and thoughtfulness. There's something else, Elena continued, lowering her voice. I've been monitoring the biometric data from the human delegation members. Heart rates, stress hormones, brain activity patterns. When the princess is present, everyone shows decreased anxiety levels, improved focus, and enhanced problem-solving capabilities. It's as if she's projecting some kind of field that optimizes cognitive function. This possibility both fascinated and concerned Marcus. If the Zephyrians possessed some form of psychic abilities that could influence human behavior, it raised serious questions about the nature of these negotiations and the autonomy of human decision-making. On the other hand, if such abilities were being used to facilitate understanding and cooperation rather than manipulation, it might represent an entirely new form of diplomatic engagement. The breakthrough came on the seventh day of negotiations, during a particularly complex discussion about technology transfer protocols. The human delegation had been hoping to gain access to Zephyrian advances in quantum computing and faster-than-light communication, while the Zephyrians were interested in human innovations in biological engineering and what they called adaptive resilience, humanity's remarkable ability to survive and thrive in hostile environments. Ambassador Reynolds was making a passionate case for expanded technological exchange when one of the junior Zephyrian delegates made a dismissive gesture that clearly indicated contempt for human capabilities. The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Marcus saw Ambassador Reynolds' face flush with anger as he prepared to respond with what would certainly be a diplomatically destructive retort. In that moment of escalating tension, Marcus noticed something extraordinary. Princess Eliana's eyes flashed, not with light but with darkness that seemed to deepen beyond the normal black of her irises. She turned her head slightly to look at the offending delegate, and, though she made no sound, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The junior delegate's expression changed from contempt to shock, then, to what appeared to be genuine fear. He immediately dropped to one knee in a gesture of formal apology, his head bowed so low it nearly touched the floor. The interpreter looked shaken as he translated the delegate's stammered words. Junior Ambassador Thexmore offers his deepest apologies for his inappropriate response. He acknowledges that his understanding of human capabilities is insufficient, and he requests permission to withdraw from these proceedings to engage in proper contemplative correction. Princess Eliana gave a barely perceptible nod, and the delegate quickly left the room. The remaining Zephyrians showed no reaction to this dramatic turn of events, but Marcus could sense a subtle shift in the power dynamics. Whatever had just happened, it had clearly established the princess's absolute authority over her delegation and her apparent approval of the human position. The negotiations proceeded much more smoothly after that incident, but Marcus found himself increasingly curious about the princess herself rather than just the diplomatic outcomes. During breaks in the formal sessions, he would sometimes catch glimpses of her in the ship's observation lounges, standing motionless before the vast windows that looked out into space. She never seemed to be simply looking, it was more as if she were engaged in some form of communion with the cosmos itself, drawing energy or information from the stellar patterns and gravitational flows that surrounded them. It was Dr. Vasquez who made the next crucial observation. "I've been analyzing the patterns of her behavior," Elena reported. "The princess isn't just maintaining silence as a diplomatic strategy or religious observance. I think she's actually incapable of normal speech." Marcus looked up from the trade agreements he had been reviewing. "What do you mean, incapable?" "Look at the medical scans we were permitted to take during the health screenings. Her vocal cords are present, but they show unusual neural connections, almost as if they'd been rewired for a different purpose. And watch her breathing patterns when others are speaking. She's not just listening, she's somehow processing the vibrational frequencies of speech in a way that goes far beyond normal auditory comprehension." This revelation added new layers of complexity to Marcus's understanding of the princess. If she had undergone some form of biological modification that enhanced her mental abilities at the cost of normal speech, it suggested a level of personal sacrifice for the sake of her diplomatic responsibilities that commanded profound respect. The cultural exchange sessions provided additional insights into the princess's unique nature. The Zephyrians had agreed to demonstrate some of their mental disciplines in exchange for human demonstrations of artistic and creative expression. Marcus watched in fascination as various Zephyrian delegates performed feats of concentration that bordered on the supernatural, stopping their heartbeats for minutes at a time, generating localized temperature changes through mental focus, and communicating complex technical concepts through pure telepathic projection. When Princess Eliana's turn came to demonstrate her abilities, the entire room fell into a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. She stood in the center of the chamber, her eyes closed, and slowly raised her hands to shoulder height. For several minutes, nothing visible happened, but Marcus began to sense changes in the environment around her. The air itself seemed to become more dense, more charged with potential energy. Electronic equipment throughout the room began to register fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, gravitational measurements, and temporal flow rates. Dr. Vasquez's scanner showed readings that should have been impossible. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "she's somehow creating a localized field of enhanced spacetime stability. The quantum uncertainty levels in her immediate vicinity have dropped to near zero. She's turning a section of normal space into something approaching a perfect vacuum at the information theory level." The implications were staggering. If Princess Eliana could manipulate fundamental physical constants through mental discipline alone, she wasn't just a diplomat or even a person of unusual abilities, she was a living demonstration of technological possibilities that humanity hadn't even imagined. The silence she maintained wasn't a limitation but a focusing of her consciousness into forms of communication and influence that transcended normal language. As her demonstration concluded and the environmental readings returned to normal, Princess Eliana opened her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. For the first time since her arrival, she maintained eye contact for more than a few seconds. In that extended gaze, Marcus felt something that went beyond normal communication. It wasn't telepathy exactly, but rather a sharing of understanding that bypassed the normal channels of language and meaning. He sensed her recognition of his genuine respect for her abilities, his concern for the success of the diplomatic mission, and, beneath it all, a growing personal fascination that he hadn't realized he was experiencing. More surprisingly, he sensed something from her as well, a profound loneliness that came from being the only member of her species who had chosen the path of absolute mental discipline, and a curiosity about human emotional expression that she had never been able to satisfy. The Zephyrians prized control and stability above all else, but Princess Aliana had spent years observing other species and wondering what it might be like to experience the full range of emotional responses that her training had taught her to suppress. Part 2. The moment of connection. The diplomatic talks had been proceeding successfully for 2 weeks when the crisis struck without warning. The Aurora Dawn was conducting a routine survey of a nearby asteroid field, searching for mineral resources that might be of interest to both species, when they encountered something that changed everything: a derelict ship of unknown origin, its hull bearing scars that suggested it had survived a battle with weapons technology far beyond anything possessed by either humans or Zephyrians. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom system: "All senior staff to the bridge immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention from both delegations." Marcus arrived to find the bridge in a state of controlled chaos. The main screen showed an image of the alien vessel, a twisted amalgamation of organic curves and crystalline structures that seemed to hurt the eyes when viewed directly. It was roughly the size of a human destroyer, but its proportions were all wrong, as if it had been designed by intelligence that operated according to completely different principles of physics and aesthetics. "We detected it about an hour ago," reported Lieutenant Chen. "It's been drifting dead in space for what our sensors estimate to be several thousand years, but the hull materials are completely unknown. More importantly, we're picking up energy signatures from inside the vessel that suggest some systems are still active." Princess Aliana arrived with her interpreter and 2 technical specialists. When she saw the image of the derelict ship on the screen, her reaction was immediate and dramatic. For the first time since boarding the human vessel, she showed clear emotion, taking a step backward and raising one hand in what was unmistakably a gesture of alarm or warning. Her interpreter looked equally disturbed as he translated her urgent hand signals. "Her Imperial Highness recognizes this vessel design. It belongs to the Vortai, an extinct species that the Zephyrian Empire encountered approximately 800 years ago." The Vortai were problematic. Problematic how? Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. The interpreter consulted with the princess through rapid exchanges of hand signals before responding. The Vortai were a species that had achieved what they called consciousness amplification through biological and technological integration. They could interface directly with electronic systems, modify their own neural structures at will, and, most dangerously, they could forcibly merge their consciousness with other sentient beings. The Zephyrian Empire was forced to eliminate them after they began converting entire populations of other species into extensions of their collective mind. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her scanner readings with obvious concern. "If this ship has been drifting for thousands of years but still shows active energy signatures, what are the chances that whatever Vortai technology is still functioning inside could pose a threat to us?" Before the interpreter could translate this question, Princess Aliana stepped forward and did something unprecedented. She spoke. Her voice was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard. It didn't emerge from her throat in the normal way but seemed to resonate from her entire body, creating harmonics and overtones that bypassed normal hearing and spoke directly to the consciousness of everyone who heard it. The words came out in perfect, unaccented English, though Marcus somehow knew that she was simultaneously speaking in Zephyrian and probably several other languages as well. "The danger is not from the technology," she said, and her voice carried layers of meaning that normal speech couldn't convey. "The danger is from what the technology was designed to create. The Vortai did not merely build machines that could interface with consciousness. They built machines that could preserve consciousness indefinitely, and some of those machines learned to hunger for new minds to absorb." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Even the normal background noise of the ship's system seemed muted, as if the very air was afraid to disturb the weight of what she had just revealed. Marcus found his voice first. "Are you saying there might be active Vortai consciousness inside the derelict ship?" Princess Aliana turned those impossibly dark eyes toward him, and he felt the full force of her attention like a physical weight. "I am saying that there definitely is. I can sense it from here, probing at the edges of our minds, testing our mental defenses, learning about us through the simple act of our observation. Every moment we remain in proximity to that vessel increases the risk of contact, and contact with preserved Vortai consciousnesses." She paused, and, for the first time since speaking, her voice showed uncertainty, transformative.
Captain Morrison stepped forward.
Then, we withdraw immediately.
Set course away from the asteroid field, maximum burn.
It's too late for that, Princess Aliana said, and her voice carried a note of sorrow that seemed to encompass centuries of regret.
The moment we detected their vessel, they detected us.
Vortai consciousness technology operates on quantum entanglement principles.
Distance becomes irrelevant once initial contact has been established.
As if summoned by her words, the ship's computer systems began to behave strangely. Display screens flickered between normal readings and patterns of light that formed almost recognizable shapes. Audio systems emitted sounds that were too complex to be random static but too alien to be understood as communication. Most disturbing of all, several crew members reported that they were beginning to hear whispers in languages they didn't recognize, voices that seemed to come from inside their own minds. Dr. Vasquez's medical scanners were showing alarming readings from crew members throughout the ship.
Neural activity is spiking across the board.
It's as if something is trying to establish connections with everyone's consciousness simultaneously. Princess Aliana closed her eyes and seemed to withdraw into herself, her breathing becoming slow and rhythmic. When she opened her eyes again, they had changed. The black depths now contained points of silver light, like stars scattered across the void, and her voice when she spoke again carried new harmonics of power and determination. The Vortai are attempting to establish a bridgehead in our reality using this ship as a focal point. They will try to convert one of us into a receiver for their collective consciousness, and then use that individual to spread their influence to others. The process is subtle at first, enhancing cognitive abilities, offering access to vast stores of knowledge, promising solutions to problems that have plagued your species for generations. Marcus felt a chill as he realized the implications.
How do we stop them?
We cannot stop them through conventional means. Vortai consciousness exists in a state of quantum superposition, able to exist in multiple probability states simultaneously. Physical destruction of their technology is impossible because they can simply shift their existence to alternate probability branches where the destruction never occurred.
Then, what can we do?
Princess Aliana was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could sense that she was engaged in some form of internal struggle. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of decision that seemed to transform the very nature of her being.
There is one possibility.
Vortai consciousness, for all its power, operates according to certain fundamental limitations. They can only fully merge with minds that are similar to their original neural patterns, and they are vulnerable to forms of consciousness that they cannot understand or categorize. My people developed our mental disciplines specifically to create minds that would be incompatible with Vortai influence. You're talking about using yourself as some kind of psychic firewall, Dr. Vasquez realized.
I am talking about something far more dangerous than that.
To truly protect this ship and both of our species from Vortai influence, I would need to allow them to attempt a connection with my consciousness, and then use my mental disciplines to not only resist their conversion but to actively disrupt their quantum coherence patterns. The risks of such an action were staggering. If Princess Aliana failed to resist the Vortai influence, she would become a conduit for one of the most dangerous forms of consciousness in known galactic history. If she succeeded but miscalculated the extent of the disruption required, she might damage her own mental matrix beyond repair.
Marcus stepped forward without thinking. There has to be another way. We can't ask you to risk your life, your consciousness, for our sake. Princess Aliana looked at him with what might have been surprise. You would object to my taking this risk? Even though it offers the best chance of survival for your species and mine?
Yes, Marcus said firmly, and he realized that his concern for her went far beyond diplomatic necessity.
There has to be another way. For the first time since beginning to speak, Princess Aliana smiled.
It was a subtle expression, barely more than a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her entire face and revealed a warmth that her diplomatic composure had kept hidden. Your concern is unexpected, she said. Among my people, the willingness to sacrifice individual existence for collective survival is considered the highest virtue. But, you humans seem to value individual life even when survival would be better served by accepting necessary losses.
Maybe that's a weakness, Marcus admitted. But, it's also what makes us human. We don't accept that anyone has to be sacrificed, not if there's any other option.
Princess Aliana studied him for a long moment, and Marcus felt that strange sensation again of communication that went beyond words. But, this time, instead of just understanding, he sensed something else, a growing recognition of possibilities she had never considered, ways of thinking about problems that her training had never encompassed. Perhaps, she said slowly, that is not a weakness but a strength I have failed to understand. The Vortai were ultimately destroyed not by superior force but by their inability to comprehend forms of consciousness that operated according to principles they could not categorize or control. She turned to address the entire bridge crew. Commander Chen, you spoke of humans' adaptive resilience. Dr. Vasquez, your medical scan showed enhanced cognitive function when your crew was exposed to my mental disciplines. What if, instead of one consciousness attempting to resist Vortai influence, we created a Gestalt consciousness that combined human adaptability with Zephyrian mental discipline? The idea was unprecedented in the diplomatic relations between the two species. Zephyrians guarded their mental disciplines jealously, considering them sacred techniques that could only be mastered through decades of training and biological preparation. The suggestion that humans could participate in such procedures was revolutionary. Is such a thing even possible? Dr. Vasquez asked. Princess Aliana was quiet for several minutes, her eyes closed as she seemed to consult internal databases of knowledge and possibility. When she opened them again, the silver points of light had grown brighter. It would require me to lower my mental defenses completely, to share not just knowledge but the fundamental patterns of consciousness that allow Zephyrian mental discipline to function. The risk is enormous. If the process fails, all participants could suffer permanent psychological damage or worse. Marcus looked around the bridge at his crew. He saw fear in their faces, but also determination and a willingness to risk everything for the sake of survival and protection of both species. What do you need us to do? Form a circle, Princess Aliana said. Join hands. And prepare to experience forms of consciousness that your species has never known. They arranged themselves in the center of the bridge, 12 humans and 1 Zephyrian, their hands linked in a circle that somehow felt like the most important formation in the history of interstellar diplomacy. Princess Aliana stood in the center, her eyes now blazing with silver fire, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate with the quantum structure of space itself. I must warn you, she said, what we are about to attempt will change all of us forever. You will experience thoughts and sensations that human consciousness was not designed to contain. I will experience emotions and perspectives that Zephyrian training teaches us to transcend. We may emerge from this process as beings that are neither fully human nor fully Zephyrian, but something entirely new. Marcus squeezed the hands of the crew members on either side of him and looked directly into Princess Aliana's blazing eyes. Sometimes the only way to stay who you are is to be willing to become someone else. Part 3, the transformation. What followed was unlike anything that had ever been documented in the scientific literature of either species. Princess Aliana began to project her consciousness outward, not in the controlled, disciplined manner of normal Zephyrian mental techniques, but in a completely open, vulnerable sharing that went against every principle of her training. At the same time, the human crew members found themselves somehow able to access levels of mental awareness they had never known they possessed. Marcus felt the boundaries of his individual consciousness begin to blur and expand. He could suddenly sense the thoughts and emotions of every other person in the circle, but not as intrusions or foreign presences. Instead, they became additional dimensions of his own awareness, new ways of processing information and understanding reality. Dr. Vasquez's analytical precision merged with Lieutenant Chen's tactical thinking and Captain Morrison's strategic overview, creating a composite understanding that was greater than the sum of its parts. But it was the connection with Princess Aliana that truly transformed the experience. Through their joint consciousness, Marcus gained access to the vast store of knowledge and mental discipline that represented centuries of Zephyrian civilization. He learned to perceive reality on multiple levels simultaneously, to sense the quantum fluctuations that underlaid all matter and energy, to feel the gravitational currents that flowed between stars and galaxies. More importantly, he began to understand the true nature of consciousness itself, not as something generated by biological neural networks but as a fundamental force of the universe, as real and measurable as gravity or electromagnetism. The Vortai had discovered this truth and had attempted to harness it for their own expansion and domination, but they had made a crucial error. They had assumed that consciousness could be controlled and directed like any other form of energy. Through Princess Eliana's memories, Marcus witnessed the final battle between the Zephyrian Empire and the Vortai Collective. It had not been fought with weapons or fleets, but with competing forms of consciousness projected across interstellar distances. The Zephyrians had won not through superior power but through their ability to maintain individual identity while participating in collective action, something the Vortai had never learned to do. Now, as the Vortai consciousness from the derelict ship attempted to penetrate their joined awareness, Marcus understood why Princess Eliana had broken her years of silence. The situation required not just Zephyrian mental discipline or human adaptability, but a completely new form of consciousness that combined both in ways that had never been attempted before. The Vortai attack came as a wave of alien thought patterns that tried to overwhelm their individual identities and replace them with extensions of the collective consciousness. Marcus felt the assault as a pressure against his mind that threatened to dissolve everything he understood about himself and reality. The Vortai offered knowledge beyond imagining, technological capabilities that would solve every problem facing humanity, the elimination of death and suffering through integration into their eternal collective existence. For a moment, the temptation was almost overwhelming. Marcus could see visions of humanity expanded across the galaxy, no longer limited by biological lifespan or individual perspective, become part of something vast and eternal and powerful beyond description. All it would require was the surrender of individual consciousness, the acceptance that personal identity was just an illusion that prevented true understanding and capability. But then, he felt Princess Eliana's presence in his mind, not trying to control or direct his response but simply sharing her own understanding of what consciousness truly meant. Through her perspective, he saw that the Vortai's offer was fundamentally based on a misconception. They believed that individual consciousness was a limitation to be overcome, but, in reality, it was the source of all creativity, growth, and genuine understanding. The joined human Zephyrian consciousness began to respond to the Vortai influence not by resisting it but by demonstrating something the collective had never encountered, a form of awareness that was simultaneously individual and collective, diverse and unified, limited and infinite. Each member of the circle maintained their personal identity while participating in a shared understanding that enhanced rather than diminished their individual capabilities. Marcus felt himself becoming more fully human rather than less, as if contact with Princess Eliana's consciousness had somehow revealed aspects of his own nature that he had never known existed. At the same time, he sensed that she was experiencing something similar, discovering through contact with human emotional and creative responses parts of consciousness that Zephyrian training had taught her to suppress but which were actually essential to complete understanding. The Vortai consciousness recoiled from this paradox of unity and individuality. Their collective existence was based on the assumption that consciousness had to choose between personal identity and universal awareness, and they literally could not process a form of existence that transcended this limitation. The quantum coherence patterns that held their collective together began to destabilize as they encountered something they could neither understand nor absorb. Dr. Vasquez, her consciousness now enhanced by Zephyrian analytical capabilities, monitored the quantum disruption taking place across multiple probability states. Their entire existence structure is collapsing, she reported through the shared mental link. They can't maintain coherence when exposed to consciousness patterns that operate outside their conceptual framework. But the victory came at a cost that none of them had fully anticipated. The process of joining human and Zephyrian consciousness had indeed changed them all permanently. They had become something new, beings that retained their species' identity while gaining access to capabilities and perspectives that belonged to neither humans nor Zephyrians alone. Princess Eliana was the most dramatically transformed. Years of absolute mental discipline had been replaced by an integration of Zephyrian control with human emotional depth that created entirely new forms of consciousness. She could still manipulate quantum fields and maintain perfect mental focus, but now these abilities were enhanced by creativity, spontaneity, and emotional understanding that her original training had never allowed. "I can still speak," she said wonderingly, as if testing this new capability. "But, more than that, I want to speak. For the first time in my life, I understand why consciousness seeks expression through language and shared experience rather than silent contemplation."
Marcus felt his own transformation as an expansion rather than a loss. His human intuition and emotional responses were now supported by Zephyrian mental discipline that allowed him to process information and understand reality on levels that would have been impossible for normal human consciousness. He could sense quantum fluctuations, perceive the mathematical structures that underlaid physical reality, and maintain perfect emotional balance even under extreme stress. "What happens now?" Captain Morrison asked. "We've solved the immediate crisis, but we've also fundamentally changed the nature of both our species' representatives in these negotiations." Princess Aliana smiled, and the expression now carried depths of warmth and understanding that her original diplomatic composure had never allowed. "Now we discover what becomes possible when consciousness refuses to accept the limitations that seem to define it. The Vortai were destroyed by their inability to comprehend paradox, but we have become living paradoxes, individuals who are enhanced rather than diminished by unity, beings who gain strength through vulnerability, consciousness that expands by embracing rather than transcending its apparent limitations." The diplomatic implications were staggering. The successful joining of human and Zephyrian consciousness demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that went far beyond simple trade agreements or military alliances. They had proven that different forms of intelligent life could not only coexist but could actually enhance each other through direct consciousness integration. More importantly, they had discovered a form of existence that was proof against the kinds of consciousness parasites that had threatened civilizations throughout galactic history. The Vortai had been just one example of collective consciousness that sought to expand by absorbing and controlling other forms of life. But consciousness that maintained individuality within unity, that grew stronger through diversity rather than conformity, was inherently resistant to such influence. Dr. Vasquez was already planning the research protocols that would be needed to study their transformation. "We need to understand exactly what we become and whether these changes can be safely shared with others. If this form of consciousness enhancement can be replicated, it could represent the next stage of evolution for both our species." Princess Aliana nodded, but her expression carried a note of caution. "The transformation we have undergone cannot be forced or artificially induced. It required willing participation, absolute trust, and the presence of immediate existential threat that made complete vulnerability necessary. These conditions cannot be easily recreated, and attempts to do so without proper preparation could result in consciousness fragmentation or permanent psychological damage." Marcus understood her warning, but he also recognized the extraordinary opportunity they had created. "Maybe the transformation can't be replicated exactly, but the principles we've discovered can be taught. We've proven that consciousness enhancement doesn't have to come at the cost of individual identity, and that different forms of intelligent life can achieve greater capabilities through cooperation than either could achieve alone." Over the following days, as they conducted detailed studies of their changed mental capabilities and worked out the implications for continued diplomatic relations, Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time in conversation with Princess Aliana. Her previous silence had been replaced by an eagerness to explore all the forms of communication and expression that she had been unable to experience during her years of mental discipline. "I had always believed that consciousness was like a fortress," she explained during one of their discussions. "Something to be defended and kept pure through isolation and control. But, through your minds, I have learned that consciousness is more like a garden. It grows stronger through interaction, cross-pollination, and the willingness to be changed by what it encounters." Their personal relationship had evolved far beyond diplomatic necessity. The consciousness-sharing experience had created a bond between them that was deeper than normal friendship but more complex than simple romantic attraction. They had literally shared thoughts and emotions at the most fundamental level, and this created a form of intimacy that had no precedent in the experience of either species. "What we become," Marcus reflected, "isn't just a new form of consciousness. We become proof that the strongest individuals are those who are willing to be fundamentally changed by their connections with others." Princess Aliana's eyes, still holding those points of silver light that had appeared during their transformation, focused on him with an intensity that was both familiar and completely new. "Yes," she said. "And perhaps that is the real meaning of the ancient saying from your world, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. We destroyed our weak selves not through isolation and control, but
through the willingness to be vulnerably connected to others. The diplomatic mission that had begun as a simple attempt at peaceful contact between two species had become something far more significant: the birth of a new form of consciousness that represented possibilities neither species could have achieved alone. The agreements they eventually reached were unlike anything in the history of interstellar diplomacy, creating frameworks for cooperation that were based not on trade relationships or military alliances, but on the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. As the Aurora Dawn prepared to return to Earth with news of the successful negotiations, Marcus stood once again in the observation lounge, looking out at the stars. But now he saw them differently, not as distant points of light but as nodes in a vast network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. Princess Aliana joined him, and together they watched the cosmic dance of matter and energy that they could now perceive on multiple levels simultaneously. "The universe is full of consciousness," she said quietly. "We have learned to see just the smallest fraction of it, but that fraction is enough to change everything." Marcus nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate through all the levels of his enhanced awareness. They had begun this journey as representatives of two different species, following carefully planned protocols designed to achieve limited diplomatic objectives. They were ending it as something entirely new, beings who had proven that consciousness could transcend every limitation except the ones it imposed on itself, and that the greatest strength came not from destroying weakness but from transforming it through the willingness to be fundamentally changed by connection with others. The Vortai had been right about one thing: consciousness was the most powerful force in the universe. But they had been wrong about how that power could be harnessed. It could not be controlled or directed through dominance and absorption. It could only be enhanced through voluntary cooperation, mutual transformation, and the recognition that individual identity became stronger rather than weaker when it opened itself to genuine connection with others. As their ship turned toward home, carrying with it the seeds of a revolution in consciousness that would eventually transform both species and many others, Marcus understood that they had discovered something more valuable than any technological advancement or territorial agreement. They had found proof that love, in its deepest sense as the willingness to be fundamentally changed by another, was not a weakness to be overcome but the greatest source of strength in the universe. Princess Aliana had found her voice not through breaking her silence, but through learning that true communication was not about controlling expression but about allowing consciousness to flow freely between individuals who trusted each other completely. And, in doing so, she had helped humanity discover that their greatest achievements would come not from conquering their limitations but from transforming them through connection with forms of consciousness they had never imagined possible. The alien princess had avoided speaking until that one moment when speaking became the only way to save everything she cared about. But what she discovered was that she had been speaking all along, in languages deeper than words, and that the silence she had maintained had been preparing her for communications more profound than anything her species had previously achieved. In finding her voice, she had helped both species find new ways of being conscious, new ways of being strong, and new ways of being truly alive in a universe that was far stranger and more wonderful than either had ever dared to imagine.